When we think of death row, most of us picture men. But what about the women? In the entire U.S., only a small number of women sit on death row, and their stories are as shocking as they are rare. In this video, we're diving into the lives, crimes, and controversies of America's female death row inmates. Let's get into it. Taylor Renee Parker. Taylor Renee Parker, born in 1999, is one of the youngest women on death row in the United States. Her crime is particularly disturbing due to the extreme violence and deception involved. In 2020, Parker kidnapped and murdered a pregnant woman, Regina Wright, and then cut the baby from Wright's womb in an attempt to steal the child. Parker had falsely claimed to be pregnant, and after murdering Wright, she took the baby and pretended it was her own. Wright's body was discovered shortly after the murder, and the baby was found alive, though the child later died from the injuries sustained during the abduction. Parker was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 2021. The brutality of the crime, combined with Parker's deceptive actions, led to the death sentence. She is currently on Texas's death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. Her case is still ongoing, and appeals may be filed in the future. Patricia Blackman. Patricia Blackman, born in 1971, was a woman who lived in Dothan, Alabama. She had no major criminal record. She was known by her community as being quiet and reserved. She was caring for her 2-year-old adopted daughter, Dominiqua Bryant. Her case shocked the area because of how badly the young girl was hurt by someone she trusted. In 1999, emergency workers were called to Blackman's house and found Dominiqua dead. The girl had over 30 injuries, including a broken skull and internal injuries. Blackman first said the girl had fallen, but doctors found that she had been severely abused. Prosecutors said Blackman beat her with an aluminum bat and stomped on her. Blackman was found guilty of murder in 2002 and was sentenced to death. The jury quickly agreed with the death sentence. Blackman has tried to appeal, but her sentence is still in place. She is now on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. Lisa Leanne Graham. Lisa Graham, a businesswoman in Phoenix City, Alabama, appeared to be a devoted mother and wife. However, beneath the surface, she harbored growing conflict with her daughter, Stephanie Shea Graham, over money and personal disagreements. Lisa was in her early 40s when her role in her daughter's murder came to light. In 2007, Lisa arranged for a family friend, Kenneth Walton, to kill her 20-year-old daughter. The body was later found near a rural road, shot multiple times. Walton testified that Lisa asked him to commit the murder, offering money and other compensation. Lisa initially denied involvement, but later made incriminating statements during recorded calls. She was convicted in 2015 of capital murder for hire and sentenced to death. The court emphasized the betrayal of a mother orchestrating the death of her own child and the premeditation involved. Lisa Graham is currently held at Julia Tutwiler Prison. Her appeals are ongoing. Lisa Joe Chamberlain. Lisa Joe Chamberlain, born in 1971, became the first woman sentenced to death in Mississippi in over 50 years for her role in a gruesome double homicide committed in 2004. Chamberlain and her boyfriend murdered Vernon Hasten and Linda Heintzelman, their roommates, in a house in Hattiesburg. The victims were beaten, stabbed, and suffocated. Then their bodies were dismembered and hidden in a freezer. The couple transported the freezer to Kansas in an attempt to evade detection, but the bodies were discovered days later. Chamberlain was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder with aggravating circumstances and sentenced to death in 2006. Her boyfriend also received the death penalty. She is the only woman on Mississippi's death row, housed at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility. Rosie Alfaro. Rosie Alfaro, born in 1971, was a drug-addicted sex offender from Anaheim, California, when she committed one of Orange County's most infamous child murders. She was a mother herself and had a long history of drug abuse, theft, and unstable living conditions. At age 18, her desperate lifestyle turned fatal for a young girl. In 1990, Alfaro entered the home of 9-year-old Autumn Wallace while high on heroin and looking to steal valuables. Autumn was home alone waiting for her sisters to return. Alfaro stabbed her over 50 times with a kitchen knife to prevent her from telling anyone. The attack was exceptionally brutal, and the child fought back. Alfaro later confessed, blaming her addiction and desperation. She was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death in 1992. Her case drew intense media attention for the gruesome nature of the crime and the young ages of both the victim and perpetrator. Rosie Alfaro is currently on California's death row for women, housed at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She remains one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death in California. Her appeals have been denied, and the sentence stands. Michelle Lynn Michaud. Michelle Lynn Michaud, born in 1963, teamed up with her boyfriend, James DeVeggio, to commit a horrifying sexual torture and murder that made headlines nationwide. The pair shared a sadistic fascination with bondage and sexual violence. In 1997, Michaud and DeVeggio kidnapped and murdered 22-year-old Vanessa Leigh Sampson, a college student. They lured her into their car, bound her with duct tape and cords, and subjected her to hours of torture before strangling her with a rope. The case was notable for its extreme cruelty and the couple's lack of remorse. Michaud was convicted in 2002 of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture, kidnapping, and SA, and sentenced to death. DeVeggio also received the death penalty in a separate trial. She is currently on death row in Chowchilla. Sakoro Caro. Sakoro Caro, born in 1951, was a well-educated, seemingly devoted wife and mother living in Santa Rosa Valley, California. Her husband was a doctor, and she was considered a traditional homemaker. But in 1999, she committed one of the most chilling acts of filicide in the state's history. On November 22, 1999, Caro and killed her 3 young sons, ages 11, 8, and 5, while they were sleeping in their beds. She then turned the gun on herself in the chin in an apparent suicide attempt, which she survived. Prosecutors argued the murders were an act of revenge against her husband during a turbulent marriage. A side note was found, blaming him for the family's unraveling. She was convicted in 2002 of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. The jury rejected her claims of insanity or diminished capacity, citing premeditation. Caro is currently on California's death row at the Central California Women's Facility. Cynthia Kaufman. Cynthia Kaufman, born in 1962, grew up in a difficult household marked by instability and abuse. By her 20s, she had fallen into a violent relationship with James Marlowe, a white supremacist and career criminal. Together, they became a deadly duo during a crime spree in California in the mid-1980s. In 1986, Kaufman and Marlowe kidnapped, raped, and murdered 4 women over the course of several weeks. Victims were SA'd, beaten, strangled, and left in remote locations. Kaufman claimed she acted under duress and was dominated by Marlowe, but evidence showed she actively participated in the crimes. She was convicted in 1989 of multiple counts of murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. Marlowe was also sentenced to death in a separate trial. The court rejected her battered woman defense, noting her full involvement in the planning and execution of the crimes. Kaufman remains on California's death row in Chowchilla. Despite repeated appeals, her conviction and sentence stand. Carrie Lynn Dalton. Carrie Lynn Dalton, born in 1959, was involved in meth and a volatile social circle in rural San Diego County. She was convicted of a particularly gruesome murder in 1988 that lacked a body or physical evidence, a highly controversial aspect of her case. Prosecutors alleged that Dalton tortured and murdered Irene Louise May in a trailer, believing the woman had stolen property. Witnesses claimed Dalton injected May with battery acid, beat her with a frying pan, and stabbed her with a knife. No body was ever recovered, and much of the case hinged on the testimony of users and acquaintances. In 1995, she was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and sentenced to death. The trial drew scrutiny for its lack of physical evidence and the reliability of witnesses. Dalton is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility on death row. Despite years of appeals, her sentence has not been overturned. Tanya Nelson. Tanya Nelson, born in 1951, was a businesswoman from North Carolina who practiced spiritual rituals and had financial ties to a fortune teller named Ha Smith. When Smith refused to help Nelson with a romantic or financial request, Nelson took revenge. In 2005, Nelson and an accomplice traveled from North Carolina to Garden Grove, California, where they murdered Ha Smith and her daughter Anita Vo. The victims were bound, suffocated, and mutilated. Nelson painted satanic symbols on the walls and stole items from the home, attempting to make the crime look ritualistic. Prosecutors argued it was a calculated, financially motivated double murder. In 2009, Nelson was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. The court rejected any suggestion that she was mentally ill or spiritually compelled. She is currently on death row at Chowchilla. Veronica Gonzalez. Veronica Gonzalez, born in the early 1980s, lived in Oxnard, California, with her husband and stepchildren. Described by neighbors as distant and strict, her parenting methods turned deadly for her 5-year-old stepson, Nathan Gonzalez. In 2011, Veronica fatally abused Nathan, causing internal injuries so severe that his body went into shock. He died after days of physical torment, including beatings and forced physical exertion as punishment. Gonzalez delayed seeking medical help, even though the child's condition was visibly deteriorating. Prosecutors argued she acted with extreme cruelty and that the abuse was not an isolated event. She was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and sentenced to death in 2015. The judge cited the prolonged suffering inflicted on the child in issuing the maximum penalty. Veronica Gonzalez is currently held on California's death row for women in Chowchilla. Antwanette Frank. Antwanette Frank, born in 1971, was a New Orleans police officer at the time of her crimes, an unusual and shocking detail that made her case nationally infamous. In 1995, Frank and her accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, robbed a Vietnamese restaurant where she often worked off-duty. During the robbery, she murdered her fellow officer, Ronald Williams, and 2 siblings who were children of the restaurant owners. She returned to the scene pretending to be a responding officer, but her behavior quickly raised suspicions. The motive was financial, and Frank's history of erratic behavior was later scrutinized. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1995. Lacaze also received a death sentence. Frank remains on Louisiana's death row, the only woman there, at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. Tina LaSonia Brown. Tina Brown, born in 1971, was living in Pensacola, Florida, when she became involved in a violent, revenge-driven crime alongside her teenage daughter and another accomplice. Brown's actions shocked the community and demonstrated a disturbing of maternal influence. In 2010, Brown and 2 others abducted Tiara Payne, the girlfriend of her daughter's ex-boyfriend. They beat her, forced her into a vehicle, and later set her on fire while she was still alive. The motive appeared to be retaliation related to jealousy and family conflict. She was convicted in 2012 of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. Her daughter and the other accomplice received lengthy prison sentences. Tina Brown is currently on Florida's death row at Lowell Correctional Institution. Tiara Capri Gobble. Tiara Gobble, born in 1983, was a 21-year-old mother living in Gadsden, Alabama, at the time of her infant son's death. Those who knew her described her as young, troubled, and struggling with domestic stability. Her relationship with the child's father was strained, and both were later found to be involved in the child's fatal. In 2004, Gobble's 4-month-old son, Tyree Hyson, was found unresponsive with signs of severe blunt force trauma. The baby had broken ribs, brain swelling, and skull fractures. Gobble initially gave false accounts of the injuries, later admitting to shaking and harming the child. Investigators noted old injuries, indicating a pattern of abuse. She was found guilty of capital murder in 2005 and sentenced to death. The court emphasized the repeated, violent nature of the abuse and her attempts to mislead investigators. Tiara Gobble remains on Alabama's death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison. No appeal has successfully overturned her conviction or sentence. Blanche Taylor Moore. Blanche Moore, born in 1933, was a former Sunday school teacher and the daughter of a Baptist minister. Her charm and genteel Southern demeanor masked a deadly pattern of poisoning that earned her the nickname the Black Widow. Moore was convicted in 1990 for the arsenic poisoning of her boyfriend, Raymond Reed, in 1986. She had been involved with multiple men who died or became gravely ill under suspicious circumstances. After Reed's death, an exhumation revealed he had been slowly poisoned. Subsequent investigations uncovered high levels of arsenic in 3 other victims, including her former husband and her own father. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Prosecutors argued that Moore killed for financial gain and control. Blanche Moore is the oldest woman on death row in the United States, currently in her 90s, incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Her case has inspired books and television programs due to its chilling and methodical nature. Virginia Susan Cottle. Virginia Cottle, born in 1963, had a history of drug use and petty crime. In 1998, she and her accomplice committed a brutal robbery homicide in Lexington, Kentucky, that led to her death sentence. Cottle and her boyfriend beat and murdered 73-year-old Lonetta White, a retired schoolteacher, during a home invasion. The motive was robbery. Cottle believed White had money or valuables. They bludgeoned her with a hammer, wrapped her in a rug, and set her house on fire in an attempt to cover the crime. The two then fled in the victim's car. Cottle was convicted of capital murder, robbery, and arson, and sentenced to death in 2000. Her co-defendant received a life sentence. She is one of 2 women on Kentucky's death row and is housed at the Kentucky Correctional Institute for Women. Cottle has continued to appeal her sentence, citing ineffective counsel and mitigating mental health factors. Moren McDermott. Moren McDermott, born in 1953, was a nurse anesthetist living in Los Angeles. Outwardly successful, McDermott had a dark side that emerged when financial pressures and personal resentment pushed her toward violence. In 1985, McDermott conspired with an accomplice to murder her roommate, Stephen Eldridge, to collect on a life insurance policy. Eldridge was stabbed 27 times in a brutal attack that took place while he slept. McDermott promised her accomplice part of the insurance payout in exchange for helping with the murder. The slaying was premeditated and coldly calculated. She was convicted in 1990 of first-degree murder with special circumstances of financial gain and sentenced to death. The case received major media coverage due to McDermott's profession and the betrayal involved. McDermott is currently housed at the Central California Women's Facility, where she continues to appeal her conviction. She is one of the longest-serving women on California's death row. Darlie Ruter. Darlie Ruter, born in 1970, became infamous for her involvement in the murder of her 2 sons, Devin, 5, and Damon, 6, in 1996. Her case has garnered significant media attention, largely because of questions surrounding her guilt and the controversial aspects of her trial. Ruter claimed that an intruder entered her home and attacked her and her children, but evidence at the scene seemed inconsistent with her story. The prosecution argued that she killed her sons and staged the scene to appear as if it was a robbery gone wrong. The key piece of evidence was a knife wound on Ruter's own body, which was argued to be self-inflicted. She was convicted in 1997 of capital murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, her case has been the subject of heated debates, with many believing that she was wrongfully convicted and others pointing to evidence that still suggests her guilt. Ruter remains on Texas's death row at the Mountain View unit, where her appeals have yet to result in any successful overturning of her conviction. Manling Sang Williams. Manling Williams, born in 1980, lived in Rowland Heights, California, with her husband and 2 sons. Outwardly, she appeared to live a quiet suburban life, but hidden emotional turmoil and a desire for personal freedom would drive her to commit an unthinkable act. In 2007, Williams murdered her husband and 2 young sons in one night. She stabbed her husband over 90 times as he slept, then smothered their 7-year-old and 3-year-old sons with pillows. Prosecutors argued she wanted to escape her domestic life and rekindle a romantic relationship with another man. Her internet search history included terms like ways to kill your husband. She was convicted in 2010 of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death in 2011. The jury rejected her defense of mental instability. Williams is currently on California's death row at Chowchilla. Skylar Preciosa De Leon. Skylar De Leon, born in 1979 and assigned male at birth as John Jacobson Jr., was a former child actor with a brief appearance in the TV show Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Despite early promise, De Leon's adult life spiraled into financial instability and petty crime. De Leon later transitioned to a female identity while in custody, and her case is notable for both the brutality of the crimes and her gender identity during and after trial. In 2004, Skylar and accomplices murdered Tom and Jackie Hawks, a retired couple selling their yacht. De Leon posed as a buyer, and once aboard, she and the others tied the couple to an anchor and threw them overboard alive in a murder-for-profit scheme. The crime was premeditated and exceptionally cruel. Authorities later linked De Leon to a prior murder of a man named John Jarvie in Mexico under similar circumstances. She was convicted in 2008 of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Skylar De Leon is on California's death row, housed in a men's prison, San Quentin, despite identifying as a transgender woman. Robin Lee Rowe. Robin Rowe, born in 1957, had a tragic personal history that included the deaths of 2 previous children under suspicious circumstances. In 1992, her pattern of tragedy turned into premeditated murder for financial gain. Rowe was convicted of setting a fire that killed her husband Randy and their 2 children, Joshua, 10, and Tabitha, 8, as they slept in their Idaho home. Investigators determined the fire was deliberately set using an accelerant. It later emerged that Roe had taken out multiple life insurance policies on her family members prior to the murders. She had also experienced financial and personal instability, which prosecutors argued was her motive. She was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1993. The judge cited her manipulative nature and the callousness of the crime. Robin Roe is the only woman on Idaho's death row. She remains incarcerated at Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, continuing to file appeals. Celeste Carrington. Celeste Carrington, born in 1963, worked as a janitor in Northern California and had a history of petty theft and troubled relationships. She is the first Black woman sentenced to death in California and remains a rare example of a female serial killer in the state's modern history. Between 1992 and 1993, Carrington murdered 2 people during separate robberies and attempted to kill several others. She shot former employer, Victor Kwan, during a robbery in San Carlos and later killed another woman, Beverly Bryant, during a burglary in Palo Alto. Her crimes were linked by similar patterns, including using a gun during thefts at workplaces she had cleaned. Carrington was convicted in 1994 of multiple counts of murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death. The jury found that the killings were committed during burglaries and involved lying in wait, which made them death-eligible offenses. She is currently incarcerated on California's death row at Chowchilla. Carrington has maintained her innocence and filed several appeals, but her sentence remains in effect. Heather Level Keaton. Heather Level Keaton, originally from Kentucky, moved to Alabama to live with her boyfriend John DeBlaise and his 2 young children. Seen as controlling and jealous, Heather quickly became the dominant adult figure in the home. The children's biological mother was out of the picture, leaving them under her care. Over several months in 2010, Heather abused 3-year-old Chase DeBlaise and 4-year-old Natalie. Chase died after being taped to a broomstick and poisoned with antifreeze, while Natalie had been starved, beaten, and choked. Both children's bodies were later found in different locations. Level Keaton denied harming the children, but was contradicted by testimony and evidence. She was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 2015, becoming the first woman in Alabama in nearly a decade to receive a death sentence. The jury voted 10-2 in favor of death. She is currently on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison, while John DeBlaise also sits on death row. The case is considered one of Alabama's most chilling examples of parental abuse turned deadly. Christy Michelle Scott. Christy Scott, a stay-at-home mother from Russellville, Alabama, was known as friendly and church-going. However, behind closed doors, her personal life was marred by debt and dissatisfaction. In 2008, she stunned the community when she was charged with the arson murder of her 6-year-old son, Mason. Christy set fire to their home after Mason with antihistamines, intending to kill him and collect on a life insurance policy. The fire was set with accelerants and planned to look like an accident. Investigators discovered that Christy had taken out multiple insurance policies shortly before the murder. In 2009, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Jurors cited financial motive and betrayal of maternal duty in choosing the death penalty. Scott remains on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison. Her appeals have so far failed. Sherry Lash Rhodes. Sherry Lash Rhodes, born in 1966, was once a tribal housing authority official for the Cedarville Rancheria in Modoc County, California. She had a falling out with other members of the tribal council over allegations of embezzlement and misuse of tribal funds. These disputes would later lead to a shocking act of violence. In 2014, during a tribal eviction meeting, Lash Rhodes opened fire on family members and tribal officials, killing 4 people, including her brother, niece, and nephew. 2 others were wounded. She chased victims as they attempted to flee, and later attempted to stab a 5th victim with a butcher knife. The attack appeared to be fueled by anger over her removal from the tribal council. She was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to death in 2016. Lash Rhodes is now on California's death row. Melissa Lucio. Melissa Lucio, born in 1968, is an advocate for those who argue that she was wrongfully convicted. Her case has drawn attention due to allegations of coercion during her confession and claims that her conviction was based on insufficient evidence. In 2007, Lucio was convicted of the murder of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, who died from blunt force trauma. Prosecutors argued that Lucio caused the death, citing bruises found on the child's body. However, Lucio's defense team claims that Mariah's death was accidental, resulting from a fall, and that Lucio's confession was coerced after hours of questioning. Lucio was sentenced to death in 2008. Over the years, her case has been the subject of widespread controversy, with various legal experts and activists claiming she did not receive a fair trial. She remains on Texas's death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, where her legal team continues to push for her exoneration. Lucio's case has gained renewed attention from advocacy groups who argue that she may be innocent,